What we had is a version of embedded Java which will run on an ARM v6 processor. But the specification for ARM v6 doesn't mandate the inclusion of a floating point unit. So we don't expect there to be a floating point unit, so we don't actually configure it to use hardware floating point. So we configure it to use a library which will emulate the idea of floating point, do the mathematics in software. Floating point units only became mandatory or part of the specification, if you like, on ARM v7. In terms of the Raspberry Pi, it does have a floating point unit in there. So there is hardware acceleration for floating point mathematics. The thing is that if you use a library and you do it in software, it's a lot slower than doing it using the hardware. So that becomes an issue in terms of performance. What we need to do is we need to create both a Linux distribution and a version of the JVM that use the hard floating point capabilities of the machine. So there needs to be a special implementation, special version that we can make available. So we need special builds of both. Right now, the Raspberry Pi organisation have released a version of the distro which is based on Debian, which is compiled to use the hard floating point. So there's the Raspberry distro, which is the most common one that people are using, and that's available to use hard floating point. Oracle are currently working on hard floating point version of the JVM. It's one of those things that's actually technically very simple, but not simple to actually launch it into the market. The reason for that is that from a technical point of view, all we have to do is set a few compiler flags and run make, and then we get a hard floating point version of the JVM. That's the easy bit. The tricky bit is that we actually do have to test it. So we want to make sure that there aren't any enormous bugs lurking in there when we switch on hard floating point. So what we're doing at the moment is we are doing the verification of this. I have actually got a version of the hard floating point JVM that I've tried on the Raspberry Pi, and it works quite happily. But of course, because we haven't done all the testing and the QA associated with that, we can't actually launch it as a binary distribution yet. It will be happening soon. I can't give you a date. This is one of the places where my safe harbor statement is actually useful. So I can't give you a date for this, but it's not going to be a long time before that comes out.
So is there like a beta or alpha?
No.
There's testing, and you should give people to test.
I agree with you absolutely, and there will be an early access version out soon. But what we need to do is internally do the testing. Actually run all of our regression tests internally. And that does actually take a bit of time, especially because we've got Java 1 this week. We've had a lot of stuff we've been doing before Java 1. Like I say, it's not going to be a long time before you see it. So don't be thinking it's 6 to 8 months away. I mustn't mention dates. So it will be sometime in the future, but the near future, shall we say. So that's where we're at with that.